أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لقد كان لكم في رسول الله أسوة حسنة لمن كان يرجو الله واليوم الآخر وذكر الله كثيرا. I testify that without Allah there is no God. And I also testify that the Prophet Muhammad is the last, the final messenger of Allah, after whom no prophet, old or new, will come. I begin in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. I want to talk about Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, and prayer. These are three important things in the life of each and every one of us. And it should be the three most important things in the life of, indeed, every human being. But when we talk about Islam, we must not believe that Sunni Islam is the same as the original Islam, because Sunni Islam is not the same as original Islam. It is a false idea that Sunni Islam represents a standard Islam and that Shiaism developed out of Sunni Islam. In fact, it could be considered as quite the opposite. Indeed, Imams Abu Hanifa and Malik ibn Anas were students of the Shia Imam Jafar as-Sadiq. Imam Idris al-Shafi was a student of Malik, and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal studied Islamic law from Idris al-Shafi. So directly and indirectly, all the four main Imams of Sunnism benefited from the scholarship and the knowledge of the famous Shia scholar Jafar as-Sadiq. Sunnism and Shiaism are the end products of several centuries of competition between ideologies. Both madhabs, or ways of understanding Islamic laws, used each other to define their own identities and doctrines. The Qur'an states that Islam is the religion that is perfected, completed, and chosen. The question may be asked, which Islam? The Sunni version or the Shia version? Among Sunnis, there are variants of religion, each claiming to be the chosen one and condemning all others. The Shias also have their various groupings. The Sunnis have several sources to determine religious authority. One can be a muqallid of one of the four Imams or a ghayr muqallid. One can use qiyas, ijma, ijtihad. The Shias believe that their Imams, as direct descendants of the Prophet Muhammad through Fatima and Ali, are the only ones who have direct connection with Allah to be able to expound the teachings of Islam. So that each group have their own approach as to how to apply and understand and apply Islam in our lives. But there is one common expectation of all Muslims, and that is the coming of the Mahdi to revive Islam. Because everyone recognizes that Islam will degenerate at some point in time, or certainly Muslims will degenerate, and some Mahdi or guide is going to come to bring back Islam to its original form. So the Sunnis believe that the Mahdi is yet to be born, and the Shias' belief is that he was born, but as a child he disappeared. He is in hiding and will one day make his appearance. Islam is neither a Sunni version nor a Shia version. The divisions within these two versions are entirely man-made. The advent of the Mahdi in the person of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad Lahori, and him being a recipient of non-prophet divine revelation, gives him the authority to be the spokesperson for Allah For he is appointed by Allah, and with Allah's guidance, he reforms the thinking of Muslims without changing anything of God's words in the Qur'an. The writings of the promised Messiah clearly emphasize that the Prophet Muhammad is the final prophet after whom no prophet, old or new, will come. The Prophet Muhammad also possesses the excellences of all previous prophets and is the ideal model of a leader. The Quran states, "Indeed, there is for you in the Messenger of Allah an ideal model for whomsoever desires Allah and the day beyond and is mindful of Allah always." As an ideal model, or any ideal model, is one who sets a path that you can follow. If a person achieves or does something that you cannot follow, then that person is not a model for you. The Prophet Muhammad's Miraj then must have been a spiritual experience that we too are able to attain. If it were a physical ascension that his followers cannot attain, then he cannot be an example for them. The Miraj of the Prophet is an attainable experience and not something so far out of this world that we could never attain it ourselves. The importance of the Miraj to us depends upon our interpretation. For those Muslims who interpret it as a physical experience, then because Muhammad is a perfect example, if he could attain it, they too should be able to reach heaven. Otherwise, his experience is of no example to them, no benefit to them. Muhammad fails as a leader for those who cannot follow his example of going up physically to heaven. On the other hand, if Muhammad's Miraj is spiritual, a spiritual experience, then his followers should also be able to achieve that experience and enhance their spiritual selves. Those who accept a spiritual interpretation must also let that interpretation enhance their spiritual life and cause them to also attain a spiritual ascension. The Prophet Muhammad clearly said, "Prayer is the miraj of the believer." Prayer is a spiritual experience, and I know I can attain miraj because I can, through my prayer, through my salah, I can attain nearness to Allah. Therefore, the acceptance of the miraj as a spiritual experience is more meaningful to me. It is also attainable by me, for the miraj is indubitably linked with salah or the daily prayers. The miraj of the Prophet Muhammad, it is agreed, was in two phases. The first of these two phases is a spiritual transformation from the sacred mosque to a distant mosque, as stated in the translation of the Qur'an in chapter 17, verse 1. And the second phase is a rise to a state of eminence in which he had a spiritual vision of his Creator. The Quran does speak about the Isra night. It calls it a vision in chapter 17, verse 60. It's a spiritual transformation from one mosque to another because the Quran says it's a ruya, which is a vision or spiritual experience while awake, compared to manam, which is an experience while asleep. A vision when one is asleep. A dream. The Quran further tells us in chapter 53, verse 11, that not only was it a vision, but it was also a vision seen by the heart, that is, not by the eyes. It was not seen by the eyes, but by the heart. So the Quran is quite clear about the nature of this experience. We have now to understand what the Quran is talking about in this first phase that we call the Isra. In verse 1 of chapter 17, the Quran uses two words. One is masjid and the other is haram. Haram must not be confused with haram, which is a different word that is applied to both Mak-ka and Medina. Haram means forbidden. It is translated as sacred also. Masjid in Arabic also has two meanings. It means a place of prayer as well as a time of prayer. Both these meanings are used in the Qur'an. In chapter 7 of the Qur'an, Allah says, O children of Adam, take charge of your appearance at every masjid. That is, at every time of prayer. Masjidul Haram, therefore, means a place or time in which prayer is forbidden. And Masjidul Aqsa means a remote time of prayer. That is, a remote time where prayer will be allowed. Chapter 17, verse 1 is now translated as, All honor be to him, Allah, who took his servant, his worshipper, at night time, from the time when prayer was haram to a remote time of prayer. From a time when prayer was haram, forbidden, to a remote time of prayer. It is well known in Islamic history that during the early period of Islam, so great was their opposition to Muhammad and his companions that they could not perform their prayer in the Kaaba. This is referred to in chapter 96, verses 9 and 10 of the Quran, and in chapter 48, verse 25. Reports state that there were those who threw stones in the Prophet's way when he was going to pray. Even an old woman threw stones in his pathway. Someone put the dead fetus of a camel on his back as he prayed. They harassed him. They locked him up in a valley for 2 years. The Arab had allowed anyone with any god to worship in the Kaaba. Muhammad was the only person who was prevented from doing so. It was in this way that the Kaaba became haram, forbidden for him. The community in which Muhammad grew up prevented him from worshipping in the Kaaba, and he and the Muslims were eventually shut up in a valley for 2 years. The Quran also speaks of the victory when Muhammad will regain the opportunity to once again worship one God, Allah, in the Kaaba. The vision of the Isra was to become a reality. This is mentioned in chapter 48, verse 27 of the Quran. The lesson of the Miraj, therefore, is a practical illustration in Muhammad's life and a hope for souls of all human beings and for us also. Sometimes, circumstances or conditions are such that prayer becomes a burden and sometimes somewhat difficult for us. The promised Messiah Mirza Ghulam Muhammad has said that if you find you're not satisfied with prayer, repeat it. Pray and continue praying until you are satisfied, just as a person who takes some kinds of intoxicants will not stop unless he or she is fully intoxicated. Prayer must intoxicate us with the love of Allah. And if we are not intoxicated, keep praying. Pray more and more until you become intoxicated. There are occasions that prevent us from worship. It may be that we are immersed in our business, our family, our occupation, our hobbies. We may be stuck in traffic, or other interests that we can't have time for prayer. The time for prayer becomes haram for us because we make it so. When we allow the circumstances and the environment to be such that we don't have time for prayer. Whenever prayer is burdensome or difficult in our lives, Allah promises us a time later on, a remote time, when the soul will find circumstances which are conducive to the adoration of its Maker. If we really want a time in which prayer will be convenient, we have to pray to Allah whenever and however it is convenient. A prayer for this is given in chapter 14, verse 40. The Miraj contains two important points. The first point is that the soul of the individual has to be yearning to worship God. I want to worship Allah, but I find it difficult to do so because the mosque is locked. That may be one problem. But that does not mean that your home is locked, your bedroom is locked, your prayer room is locked. Occasions and the opportunity or the time for prayer is locked because you are busy doing other things. But never let your heart be locked from the worship of Allah. Of course, there are exceptions. But the intention must always be there to worship Allah, to worship God. If we find it difficult to do so, we must have hope. We must have the expectation that the circumstances will change and we will readjust our lives so that we can worship our Creator. The second point is the transporting of the soul to a time when nothing can hinder it from worshipping Allah. You have your soul worship God, but you find it difficult to do so. But you look forward to the time that will come when you will not be prevented. Whatever excuse or hindrance you have for not keeping up prayer at some point in time, that excuse or hindrance will be removed. The Miraj is also a testimony to the fact that by following the Qur'an, Muhammad did not only preach God, but he reached God. In the Laylatul Qadr, the Qur'an was revealed to Muhammad so that he can bring himself and all human beings to Allah. In the Miraj, Muhammad proved that the Qur'an works in that it can bring himself and all his followers in nearness to God. And that is attained through prayer. So that when we look at the life of the Prophet Muhammad, we see that one of the impacts of the Miraj on his life is not only did he attain nearness to God, but his nearness to God meant something for his community and society. He was able to transform them and change their habits no matter what they were, whether it was intoxicants, drugs, gambling, adultery, murder, idolatry, warfare, and so much more. He was able to change his people. The Quran tells us that the Arabs considered the prayers of the Messenger as bringing them nearer to Allah. If we are thinking of our society and our nation and our country and we want to bring about change, we can only do so with the strength we get from our Creator. We cannot get this strength from Allah by remote control. We cannot just wish it. We have to go to God to get the power of God. The Miraj indicates that to us, that when Muhammad had the greatest opposition, he went to God. And God gave him the main tool to develop the strength in him to change his people. And that tool is prayer. To change our nation and to change our homes and family and our community, we have to attain our Miraj by realizing the importance of prayer in giving us the strength to be able to bring about that reformation and transformation that our society needs for everyone, every human being, to live in peace and harmony. بارك الله لنا ولكم في القرآن العظيم ونفعنا وإياكم بالآيات والذكر الحكيم إنه تعالى جواد كريم ملك بر رؤوف رحيم.